Welcome to the LDA podcast, a series by the Learning Disabilities Association of America. Our podcast is dedicated to exploring topics of interest to educators, individuals with learning disabilities, parents, and professionals to work towards our goal of creating a more equitable world. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the LDA podcast. I'm here today with Rebecca Resnik, who is a licensed psychologist and founding partner of Rebecca Resnik and Associates Psychological Care. Rebecca is also a past president of Maryland Psychological Association. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you.
My pleasure.
Of course. So, to just start us off, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes. So I first became interested in learning disabilities, just like so many other people, because of my family. And my mother and father both were undiagnosed folks with learning disabilities. Of course, in that generation, you were not diagnosed. You were labeled as dumb or lazy or, just a girl, or you're not trying hard enough. My little brother was actually properly diagnosed with learning disabilities when he was about 6 years old. And I watched my mother, who barely graduated from high school, even though she's very smart, I watched her become like the warrior advocate for him. And I watched my parents struggle to get him what he needed and make sure that he could read. A lot of sacrifice of, financial resources, time. I listened when my mother would talk about all of the awful things that people said to her and to my brother as they were really just trying to make sure that he could read and graduate from high school. And that very much set me on my path. So I started my special education career back in the 1990s. Now, the 1990s was a time when special education was fully embracing whole language. And for the parents who don't remember the 90s, whole language was a time when phonics and really the evidence base of reading largely got thrown out the window in favor of an ideology that had never been tested. And it took over. And this was also a time when special education was shifting over to inclusion. And we were moving towards inclusion very fast, but without a plan. So this was a really kind of a chaotic time to be in special education and learning about how things worked. And when I started teaching, I found that a lot of the things I had been taught were not true and didn't work. I think a lot of people who've taught really get that sensation. It's almost like you feel like you were betrayed. And then you have to, figure out where you're going to go and what you're going to do. Are you going to stay in teaching? For me, I went back to school and I just fell in love with neuropsychology. It was so exciting that, unlike when I went to school in the 90s, we actually understand things about the brain now at this point. And I just love my job. I love meeting families and trying to help understand what's going on with their kids and what we can do about it. That is what gets me up in the morning.
Absolutely. That's such a fantastic backstory. We have so many people come on the podcast who are inspired because they want better for either what their friends or their relatives have went through. So why is it important when we're going to talk about learning disabilities versus learning differences? Why is it important to differentiate between the two? Why are the two different and why should we keep them that way?
Okay, so when we use the term disability, we're really talking about something about a person that is causing subjective distress and functional impairment. And functional doesn't mean like, oh, people are machines or robots. Functional means, can you perform all the functions that you need to perform to get through your day and hopefully achieve your goals and have a high quality of life? So that's the sense that I'm talking about functional impairment. And when you've grown up watching people struggle with learning disabilities and when your whole job is meeting with people who are in a lot of pain, often very stressed, very worried about their kids, the fact that we're really talking about neuropsychologically based disabilities is something that I eat, sleep, and breathe. And I certainly understand that, people really don't like hearing that label. All of us, we're either parents, I'm a parent, or we're in the helping professions. And we don't like that sense of we're going to label someone, we're going to limit them, we're going to cause them to be seen in a way that feels derogatory or less than. From my personal perspective, calling something a difference covers up how hard it really is for folks with disabilities. Learning disabilities are disabling at this point. One of your previous guests was talking about the connection between folks who have learning disabilities and how often they wind up actually in the criminal justice system. We know that low literacy greatly limits your opportunities in life, your quality of life, even your lifespan. These things cause a lot of suffering. And so to me, using the term disability is not only sort of accurate because I'm a healthcare provider, but it also honors the struggle.
I think that's a fantastic answer. We also like to say that disability isn't a bad word, and that it also entitles people to their rights under the IDEA and ADA. So
absolutely, yeah. And if we're calling something a difference, unfortunately, in our modern world, the way it is, insurance doesn't cover things that are differences, and schools don't provide services for folks who have differences. And so we, for better or for worse right now, we really have to show that there's a really significant obstacle in this person's way. I think it's also important to mention that we hear a lot that, oh, kids have like a different learning style or their brain just works differently. And I know people are going to get their tomatoes out and to throw at me when they hear this, but the idea of learning styles, that everybody just has a different learning style and we haven't found this kid's learning style yet, the science really doesn't back this up. What we have come to understand about how kids learn to read is that we have treatments that work really well that address the underlying problems. And so to talk about kids as just having like, oh, it's a different learning style, their brains just work differently. I think this takes our focus away from how do we treat and how do we help and how do we make an evidence-based plan.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. So I wanted to move into LDA's specific learning disabilities, evaluation principles, and standards. You had the chance to review them. And I had wanted to ask, how do these standards align with what we know about the neuropsychology of learning disabilities and also the neuropsychological approaches to evaluation?
So for me, going through the LDA standards was really exciting. I have actually been reading LDA standards and position papers ever since I was in college, because I was very fortunate to train under Dr. Deborah Spees, who was on like the original paper that came out talking about how the discrepancy-based model wasn't a valid way of identifying kids with learning disabilities. So this is really near and dear to my heart. And what I really like is when we are finding ways to bring the science into the practical world, into the clinics where people are making diagnoses, into school psychologists' offices, into classrooms, into homes. One of the huge problems that your guests and me too now talk about is how siloed all of the science is and how hard it is to get this information out to the folks who actually have to teach kids to read. Having been a special educator, that's a very hard job. I came home exhausted and burnt out, on a regular basis. I didn't have time to go to conferences and read a lot of journal articles. So part of what these standards do is really serve as a wake-up call for all of us in the field to remind us that we need to do better. I don't think anyone would look at the data about how we're serving our students right now and the outcomes and feel like, oh, we're doing all we can. Our kids and our families really deserve better. And so these standards, one thing I really like is that they're very much grounded in science. And they are affirming that learning disabilities are disorders of basic psychological processes. Now, what does that mean? That means things like expressive and receptive language development, working memory, visual information processing, auditory processing, processing speed and efficiency. these are what make our brains special as human beings. This is what makes our brain work. Now, the human brain is super plastic. So unlike a baby ant, we don't come into the world like pre-programmed, ready to do all of the things an ant needs to do. We have this long period of brain development. And the amazing thing about that is that this gives us the time to learn all of the things we need to know about our culture and what's expected of us. And we're social animals. We have to learn to get along with our fellow humans so that we can survive and thrive and be part of a community in whatever way makes sense to us. So when we think about what academics actually are, and I'm borrowing from Stanislaus Dehaene right now, and Mark Seidenberg and giants like that, what academics really are is they're cultural overlays. The human brain is being asked to use the circuits that it came designed with, and those circuits get shaped around what does this young child need to learn in order to be successful in his, her, or their culture. Brains don't come ready to read. We hopefully all know this. Brains don't come ready to write. The brain has to use the neurons and circuits and white matter tracts that are already there to build a reading brain. So when they say that teachers actually rewire the brain, that's not just like a cute thing on a coffee cup. That's literal. The difference between a reading brain and a brain that hasn't learned to read yet, things you can actually like see and measure. So what are we thinking about here? We're thinking about using these capacities of the brain, things like paying attention, expressive and receptive language, working memory, processing speed, visual information processing, all of these hard capacities that we came with, and they have to get reshaped. Now, if your brain is functioning somewhat suboptimally, maybe that's due to your neurons not migrating to the proper position. Maybe it's due to some genetic differences. Maybe it's due to pathogenic care during your early years. Maybe it's due to super high levels of stress when you were a baby, or maybe you were exposed to something in utero, and your brain is not ready to build the circuits that allow you to adopt super complicated behaviors like reading and writing. That's what's going on. It's really that the brain is functioning differently. And if we don't understand the why behind academic problems, then we really don't know what to do about them. Like we can describe, okay, little, I'll use my niece and nephew's names. Malik can't read. Okay, we may give him a reading assessment. We may look and say, oh yes, look, Malik can't read. Okay. But how do we understand why Malik can't read and what's getting in his way? And how do we really think about Malik in particular as a person and what he needs in order to make some progress? So again, I really like the fact that the standards are embracing the science, that they are brain-based. I also really like the emphasis on holistic assessment. Now, holistic, usually we think of holistic as being kind of new agey. Like if I go to a holistic spa and, get a foot rub and my tarot cards read. But this is different from that. Then now holistic, you can think of it as like holistic sounds like whole, right? So we're talking about the whole person. We're not just going to take a look at their reading scores and say, oh, look, low reading scores. We want to understand why. And there is so much we can learn about their developing brain. We can, as I said, we can assess the language, phonological awareness, which is the ability to perceive and understand the speech stream, that acoustic stream that we all learn by bootstrapping and statistical analysis. And that's how we acquire language. We can assess phonological and phonemic processing, working memory, processing speed, vocabulary, very important for comprehension, as Tim Shanahan has taught us. And when we think about, well, what do we do to assess all of those areas? Most of those areas we can assess through an IQ test. The standards do affirm that using an IQ test and using it mindfully, using it with beneficence, using it with sensitivity to someone's culture and background and current status, this is actually really important because it gives us a lot of information about those underlying cognitive processes. We're not so concerned with, oh, what's the IQ, itself, the full scale IQ. that can actually change over time. There are a lot of reasons why somebody might not do so well on an IQ test, and maybe you have the flu, maybe you're unhoused and you're moving from like relative to relative's house. There's many reasons, but it's really important that we not be afraid to try and start gathering more information and understanding a person. So the standards do affirm that it's useful to include an IQ test. We never want to miss something really important about a child. And if a child is scoring really low on an IQ test, then we want to understand that. It's just like if I, go in for a mammogram every year because I have a genetic predisposition to breast cancer in my family, which we do, that's not a reason for me to say, yeah, I'm not going to have mammograms. No, I want to know that so that somebody can help me and track my progress and make sure I'm okay. We also really want to have what the standards recommend in the form of a multidisciplinary assessment. Now, we've heard of multidisciplinary teams. When you go into your child's meeting and you walk in and there's 10 people sitting around the table and you're very much outnumbered, all of those people are there because every one of them brings a different kind of expertise to the table. That's the way the law was designed. We can replicate that in terms of assessment. And one thing that's so important is that speech pathologists be part of our assessment. Very often they're not. I see a lot of kids who have, the school psychologist and God bless school psychologists, they are so overwhelmed right now. They may have time to give maybe one test and maybe a couple rating scales. And then usually the special educator, like I did back when I was a special educator, will do the achievement test. Those two people may not have any time to talk to each other. And maybe a social worker can do a parent interview. Sometimes the school psychologist can, but oftentimes all the information really isn't pooled until everybody's sitting there around the table, and you've got to get through that IP meeting really fast because you've got 5 more to go that day. So these standards remind us that a kid is not just a set of scores. And a set of scores really isn't that helpful to a teacher. When you're handing a teacher a psych eval, most psych evals are really not very useful. And I'll say that, as a psychologist, having been on the receiving end of these, sometimes they are, but a lot of times they're just a set of scores and some cut and pasted recommendations from the scoring program. The real reason we need multidisciplinary providers taking part in the assessment, making it holistic, right, about the whole child, is because we don't know what we don't know. And let's just take it for example, if we don't have a kid's hearing and vision screening information, we may diagnose a kid with a learning disability or attention deficit disorder, or worse, write a kid off as like lazy and unmotivated when we haven't even bothered to collect the data about their hearing and their vision. It used to be that kids got very reliable screening, when they went to daycare, when they went to preschool. And now during this time of budget cuts and such, we have a lot of kids where even in affluent families, I'll ask, so when was their last hearing and vision screen? And what were the results? And parents often have no idea. And they can't tell me. And I say, let's get that done, because the last thing I want to do is diagnose your child with a disability when this is really about them needing glasses. So we also have to be really mindful that for a lot of kids, there are medical/health issues, there's family genetic issues, and there are also social issues. So we talk in our field about the biopsychosocial model. And the biology is where we get the physicians and the healthcare providers. They tell us hearing and vision screen. They tell us if a kid has sickle cell, early onset diabetes, have they had concussion? Do they have a genetic difference that we need to know about so that we can understand this child's scores in context? And for social, we should really think about not just social, like who's part of their family, but what's their cultural background? What's their linguistic background? How does this family understand disability and think about their child and who their child is in the world and part of their family? And what is school about for that family? So this is also why we need the parents in there. Typically when you have an IEP meeting, it's like, oh, here's mommy and here's daddy, or here's mommy, or daddy and daddy, grandma, caretaker, whomever, but they're usually given like maybe 30 seconds to talk. And they express their concerns, and then all the professionals like take over. And holistic assessment asks the parent to be part of the assessment, where they're really providing the background, the family history, the genetic family history, especially when there's learning disabilities in the family like mine, making sure, again, that we're not just plugging through to get a whole bunch of scores plugged into a template, but we're really understanding like, who is this person? The other piece of this is that the standards are asking us to think about assessment as a dynamic process. What we tend to do is we tend to have kids take summative assessments, and that's like a big assessment, often at the end of the year. If you get an assessment in May, you have no time to do anything about it, before summer happens, and most kids don't access summer school, so we get the summer drift. And maybe getting them an IEP could be something that happens next November, where you've lost 6 months of that child's life. When we're talking about dynamic assessment, we want to go beyond just a big knockdown, drag out neuropsych eval like I do, and look for regular assessments, regular small stakes assessments, so that we can collect regular data. I can't tell you how many IEPs I read where the only way that they've indicated that they're going to see if the interventions are making any difference at all is teacher observation. And we can't ask teachers to just make observations to decide like, oh, I think these interventions are working. Maybe they are. That's too much to ask of a teacher when they've got 30 kids. We also don't know if the teacher in the school are using assessments that are actually evidence-based. If they're using the Fontes and Pinnell, for example, which is not an evidence-based assessment, and telling parents like, yeah, everything looks fine, that's not good enough. Our kids deserve better. Our kids need regular data collection, not just a portfolio full of worksheets, not just the standardized test scores every spring, but especially kids with disabilities. We need to do very fine-grained curriculum-based measurements, things like DIBELS, for example, which is a dynamic assessment of early literacy skills, things like phonemic processing, word reading fluency, sight words, decoding. We have to track these, because what we're unfortunately fighting is this trend where we wait way too long to assess a kid, especially a kid from a marginalized background or a kid whose parents don't speak English. We wait way too long. And then by the time we assess this child, as the standards indicate, we often don't get a particularly useful assessment that guides what has to happen next. And so here we have this poor kid who is falling farther and farther behind. By the time we get them some services, maybe the services are what they need, but it might just be, oh, this is our tier 1 level of services. This is our tier 2 level of services. Well, imagine you go into the doctor with a headache and you say, doctor, my head, it hurts so bad. And the headaches seem to be getting worse. And the doctor says, okay, we're not going to do any tests. What we're going to do is tier 1. And so tier 1 is you're going to take some aspirin and you're going to take a nap and call me in 6 months. And if it doesn't get better in 6 months, we'll go to tier 2. Nobody functions that way. Nobody. And here we are with our precious little children behaving in ways as if getting data about this child, like as if it doesn't even matter, and sort of putting them into special education programs where we don't know if they're working for a really long time. But what we know in the aggregate in this country is that a lot of kids get special education and don't catch up. And when they don't catch up, that has implications for the rest of their entire life, their loved ones' lives, and their children's life, because they're passing on whatever resources they got to the next generation. And as I've said before, our kids really deserve better.
Absolutely. And that was such a great answer. I mean, you touched on so many different points, and I really appreciate you going into it, because it can be an intimidating document to read if you're not a psychologist or you're not familiar with these terms. So I think you did a great job of breaking it down so that teachers and parents and individuals with learning disabilities or any other listeners are really able to understand why this is so important and why LDA is pushing these standards as hard as we are. So thank you for that.
You're you're right. No, I'm really passionate about it, but you can hear the special educator in me because,
Yes.
what I was taught was like, break it down, put it into
Mhm.
chunks, all of these things. So I know that was long, but hopefully it made sense.
No, it absolutely did. So, what are some of your own evaluation practices that align with these standards? And are there any aspects of these standards? I know you talked about this previously, but are there any of the standards that particularly resonated with you in your own practice?
What really resonates with me, as you can probably tell, is that having been formally trained as a special educator and then gone through the training to become a psychologist, one of the things that really concerns me about both of these fields, but even, my heart is in special education. And one of the things that frustrates me to no end is how we kind of make some steps forward in terms of the science, and then we seem to run away from it. And we almost get shiny object syndrome sometimes where, we don't love to teach the things that are boring. And so, or the things that we don't really understand. And so we're very susceptible to getting seduced, if you will, by a super cool marketing package with like great, marketing and advertising. And this is your specialty. These things work because clever people design them to sell curriculum and products, and all that's great, but the science is harder to understand. It takes a lot of time. Like psychometrics courses were no walk in the park. Neuropsychology training, it's long and it's hard. And I think when we don't do a good job making that information accessible to people, then practitioners become really vulnerable to hearing ideas that sound really good, and they resonate with us as caretaking, helping profession types of people. I mean, that's why we're in this field. And we can easily find ourselves, going down a garden path, for example, like when I watched my fellow students in graduate school, we took classes in how to be a whole language teacher. And it was so fun. It was so fun designing a whole lesson around like the snowy day, the story about little Peter and the snowball. And, you would have the kids read the book and do book tastings and writer's workshop. And it was so fun, very creative. I loved the idea of like, yes, teacher as facilitator, helping kids on their journey. The problem is, though, is that when we go down those paths and we start like resisting the science, or even being hostile to it, as Emily Hanford says, we're not serving our students. And, again, the proof's in the pudding. How are our reading scores? How are people doing? Are our kids going through special education for a while or going through RTI and catching up? And if they're not, we have to take a really hard look at ourselves, because the kids are not the ones to blame. It's all of us as professionals. And I'm 50 years old. And, at this point, the people my age, we're in charge. We're the ones who are, the administrators. We're the ones who are buying curriculum. We're the ones who are mentoring the younger teachers. And a lot of us don't know how to teach reading. We have no idea like how brains learn to read because we were taught something that just wasn't true. And so it's very upsetting to me. So you can hear me going on and on about that. Okay, but so that's what resonates with me. But let's talk like practices. So I had the benefit of training in schools, and they had the benefit of training in pediatric rehabilitation hospitals. So for when I'm seeing a kid in my practice, I'll often be seeing a child who is much more complicated, who has an identified like genetic anomaly. Maybe they were a micropreemie, and have some cerebral palsy, learning disabilities, love learning disabilities, ADHD. We see neurodiverse kids who are autistic, kids who have come from really kind of upsetting backgrounds. Sometimes we get to hear about kids who have been traumatized, kids who lived in orphanages or institutions for a lot of their short little lives. And so for us, taking that holistic picture is so important, because we need to really understand at a deep level what's going on with this child, and how did that impact their brain? How did that impact their attachments, their executive functioning, their motivation, their belief system? So in private practice, I have the luxury of being able to spend a lot more time in my evaluations. So I can call up the kid's pediatrician, I can call up the therapist, I can call up the teacher. I realize that, when you're working in schools, time is something you do not have. But the issue is, we could have that if we wanted. It's like the end of the Lorax. You remember when the Lorax is saying, unless people like you care and start making some good trouble and doing things, nothing changes. Nothing changes in education unless a lot of parents and teachers start demanding that it has to change. When we start saying this isn't good enough, when we start bringing the science in, that's when we really get that friction and tension that leads us to make some positive changes for kids. We should be giving every kid all of the assessment that they need. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We could do this if we had the will to do it, and if we got together and really, forgot about who's in what party, but work together to make this positive change for our kids.
I want to talk a little bit more about that holistic approach. How important is it that evaluators assess executive functioning skills and social emotional functioning as well when assessing a student for possible SLD?
It's a bigger deal now post-pandemic than even it was beforehand. There was an article in the paper just today, I forget which one, because I read several, about how the very young generation of kids, the kids under 5, are coming into their first preschool, their first daycare, developmentally really behind. And this is not news to those of us in the clinical world, because I'm talking with teachers all the time. That's one of my favorite things to do. These are my people. We speak the same language. We think the same way. And I am hearing more and more from the folks who are in the trenches about the mental health crisis, this crisis of young children who are being, raised by screens instead of having opportunities to play. A lot of kids did not get enough opportunity to have those foundational literacy experiences that they need. Preschool, when we're doing things, like singing little songs about baby bumblebees and itsy bitsy spiders, that's developing phonemic processing and phonemic awareness and sound discrimination. All of these things so important. Now let's go for executive functioning, because executive functioning is the goal-directed activities of the human brain. Whenever you decide, I want to eat, I want to, I want to go to college, I want to stay married instead of having a fight, I want to drive to 7-Eleven, all of these things, these are all about executive functioning. And academics require us to have a fairly intact executive functioning system such that our brain can do things like control our attention, learn new information, hold information in mind long enough to solve a problem. Like, if you want to think about the difference between solving 1 + 2 and then, think about a quadratic equation, the amount of cognitive counter space you need to do one versus the other, really different. Okay, so when we think about executive functioning, we're talking again about achieving goals. And as we get older, the goals we can achieve become more and more sophisticated. This is like the work of Martha Denkla, for example. We go from being able to achieve very simple goals. Let's find a word that rhymes with bee. Let's find a word that rhymes with cup. And reading War and Peace all the way, or Native Son, another really big complicated books, all the way at the end of that. For our kids who are struggling with attentional control, with working memory, and I mean by that holding information in mind so that it can be used to solve a problem, kids' ability to retain information over time, to hold on to what they've learned and build on that so that they can then be ready to learn the next thing. Being able to inhibit your impulses. When you want to do something, but your brain says, nope, stop it, not right now, maybe later. That's really important when you're talking about going to school, because school is all about, focusing and sitting still and controlling your impulses for a while until you get to recess. The best executive functioning tools, to my mind, are actually academic tools. When I'm asking kids to do assessments of reading, writing, and mathematics, especially writing, such a demanding executive functioning task. There's so much to pay attention to in order to just write a paragraph, so much information to hold in mind to really make that happen. It's remarkable that here we are as like primates, and we can, sit down and write poetry, or play a game of chess. You also brought up the social emotional piece, and this is particularly timely right now because we do have a lot of kids who are not okay. We have a lot of kids who are in crisis, and they're in crisis at younger and younger ages. It used to be that we thought of things like eating disorders, for example, as being something that happened like to older teens and college students. And now we're seeing like 11 and 12-year-olds who are developing pathological relationships with food and purging and binging, because the internet is just opening up the floodgates of all of this really, dangerous information for kids who don't have the frontal lobe capacity, don't have the executive functioning maturity yet to make really wise decisions. We also, as assessors, have to think really hard about what is this child's background like, particularly if they've been unhoused, if their parents are getting divorced, if they face some kind of abuse, if they've been refugees. All of these things are so important. And it's important not just for the kid, but for their family at large, because we know now that trauma gets passed down through generations, not just in terms of like the stories that your parents tell, but it changes your genes, it changes the intrauterine environment. So trauma has a major impact on executive functioning, as does stress. So if you have a kid who has lived their whole life in a state of marginalization or abuse or some kind of pathogenic care, you have to pay a lot of attention to what did that do to their brain, and how can we help that little brain to heal and overcome those things so that they can have all the opportunities that they deserve to have in life.
Absolutely. So your practice also offers advocacy services. So I wanted to talk about what are some of the issues that families of students with specific learning disabilities bring to you when they are seeking support.
So we're doing advocacy in large part just because the advocates that we referred to got overwhelmed. And in Bethesda, Maryland, we have a lot of advocates. We have a lot of wonderful advocates who really work collaboratively with schools and come in with the spirit of how am I going to help? That's what we're after. I mean, the last thing I want, having been on the other side of a special education table and seen advocates who seem to want to come in and just throw a Molotov cocktail into the meeting, figuratively speaking, that doesn't help anybody. So the reason we're thinking a lot about advocacy is because every now and then we come across a family where we know they're up against some kind of obstacle in getting help for their child. And almost every time it is folks on the team who are well-meaning, they care a lot, but they're tired and they're burnout and often don't know what they don't know. Largely that's because they were taught things that now we know aren't true. They may have been taught things about how kids learn to read that aren't true. They may be misunderstanding what a child's disruptive behavior actually means and have written a kid off as difficult. And this kid's so difficult. This parent is such a pain in my neck. And, I have so much work to do and I just don't have the patience for that. I've been there as a special educator. I've definitely been called a lot of names. And, I know that's not an easy job. We also run into situations where families are told, like, just wait and see. Oh, he's a boy. I hear that one a lot. Or, oh, he'll talk when he wants to. Oh my goodness. If you have a 3.5-year-old that's not talking and a professional tells you like, well, he just doesn't want to talk, he's being willful. Whoa, that's the kind of situation where it takes a village, and it's time for the rest of the people to step forward and help get this situation back on track. Because parents are so vulnerable. They go into those multidisciplinary team meetings. Maybe it's one parent. It's hard to take time off, and one parent versus 12 other people who are all, they all know what they're going to say. The IEP's been written. Newsflash. You don't write the IEP in the meeting. You wrote it last week, probably on a Sunday afternoon on your time off. So the Reading League has this little saying, like, when you know better, you do better. And I think that's so important for us as the professionals who can bring to the table more about what's happening with the child's brain. For me, I can bring in more information about science of reading. I can bring in more information about, for example, if you have a kid who is more than a grade level behind in reading, 30 minutes of push-in a couple times a week where they're just doing like reading recovery, this isn't going to help. And the other piece about advocacy that you can probably tell is a big one for me is that sense of urgency. You get very tired when you're working for a school and you're very constrained by the rules about eligibility and what tier level of services are we providing? How far do we have to go through our RTI tiers before we determine we need more information? How bad did the child's study meeting go? Did we have a parent crying and nothing happened? We are not often as upset about things as we need to be. We need to have a sense of urgency whenever we have a child who, even in the very young grades, is not meeting their pre-literacy benchmarks. The last thing we can say is, well, we have to wait until they're 2 years below grade level. A first grader is not really going to be 2 years below grade level, not for a while. We can't say things like, yeah, but we're just going to keep going for another 6 months and just take a wait and see approach, because the sense of urgency is so important, because we know from the data that kids don't catch up. And we know that the impact of a disability is a lifelong burden to bear if no one ever provided the right kind of help and treatment. It causes a lot of suffering, and it causes a lot of underachievement and missed opportunities. If you want to think from a national level, it impacts our whole country. When we have Democratic voters who don't have enough reading skills that they can, read a political position paper. When we have people who don't read well enough, for example, to read the lease on their apartment or the contract at their job, or they can't read the information about how to take your prescriptions after your surgery. This has impacts for all of us as a community. It's not just the child, it's not just the parent, but it's all of us. And it's something that, with things like the standards, we really can start using tools like this to band together and try to make things better for kids.
Absolutely. And that not waiting and seeing is so important, because as the child goes on, that knowledge just compounds and they get farther and farther behind. So again,
and
so glad you brought that up.
not only academically, but what it does to someone's self-concept to be living with that sense of shame, that sense of discouragement. Kids will tell me, yeah, like, I'm the dumbest one in the class, I can't learn. And that's tragic. That's not supposed to happen for kids.
Absolutely. Well, Rebecca, again, thank you so much for being on the show. We loved having your expertise.
Pleasure.
You have so many great perspectives. So we'd love to have you on again, but for now, thank you again so much.
Lauren, it was great meeting you, and keep up all the great work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the LDA podcast. To learn more about LDA and to get valuable resources and support, visit ldaamerica.org.